How do you see content moderation come into play, especially when you're selling the data set or like licensing? How do you see Reddit actually police the data? Because Reddit is notoriously bad, no, well known for not having good type of content, but it's indexable.
Hmm.
So people still like find hacky ways to use Reddit to be on the first page.
Yeah.
How do you see Reddit actually deal with content moderation when it comes to licensing their data sets?
I think that's going to be one of the big challenges, right? I think it's interesting because for the LLMs, one of the hardest things I think is figuring out, a long time ago Google had this thing in their algorithm, right, called query deserves freshness, right? And then there's another one called query deserves diversity, right? So two different
Hmm.
concepts, right? One which you just talked about freshness, right?
Yeah.
Like you got to update the content. It has to be relevant for the moment,
Yep.
right? And that's where that portion of the algorithm is dealing with that. Query deserves diversity is trying to figure out when you do a search, right? In the in the model of classic search, right, where the searcher kind of gets 10 results or some number of results, it wants to surface different kinds of perspectives, different types of information, so that then you can make the decision of what you're going to,
Yeah.
decide and figure out, right? So query deserves diversity. Um, in the LLM world, it's going to be interesting on how they deal with this, right? Because the beautiful thing about the LLM, this is something that we saw that was one of the things that was eye opening for me, was that the AI engine behind search, for the first time in the history of search, starts to assert an informed opinion, right?
Mm.
And actually, if you look at Google's version, it starts to create pros and cons, right? Which is kind of interesting. Pros and cons of a product, pros and cons of a company, pros and cons. Like that's kind of interesting, right? Like the AI is actually deciding this is what's good, this is what's bad,
Yeah.
right? It also a big eye-opening moment for me is when I was starting to play with this. I give this as an example of how much things are going to change. Is I was searching, we were looking at the data from our parser and looking at like BMW X3. When you search for BMW X3, what shows up in the LLM version is it summarizes it and says, hey, the performance is great, but it's expensive to maintain. The parts are a little hard to find, and it's not that comfortable,
Yeah.
right? Now imagine your BMW spending $300 million a year on advertising, and then somebody goes and searches for your product, and now it pulls these things, right? Which is an informed opinion. It's pulling it, I think, from like different kinds of reviews and
Yeah.
car and driver. But now the buyer's consideration set is going to fundamentally change,
Yes.
right? And so you have this AI model that's now starting to assert an
Certain
opinion.
opinions.
So to bring it back to the Reddit thing, I think it's kind of interesting, right? How is it going to figure out how is the LLM? It's going to source lots of different perspectives and opinions. How is it going to figure out when to make something a pro and when to make something a con? When to make something positive versus something negative, and how much of it is query deserves fresh diversity, where in the past they're not taking opinion, so they're just surfacing stuff. So
Yep.
it's up to you. Whereas if they're now creating an opinion, wow, that starts to get hard. And we've seen sort of some of the challenges with that, right? Like Google's gotten into some hot water about
Yep.
this stuff, right, with Gemini. And I think that is kind of the challenge with the AI models.
Yeah. It's gonna be really interesting to see. Um, Maybe like Grok or eh, Reddit, Twitter specifically. It's because they are somewhat of an open language platforms for people to say anything they want.
Mm-hmm.
Any LLMs or anything trained on that data set is bound to have uh, quote unquote opinionated outputs.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to see what's going to happen like next. Yeah. Anyway, we're almost at time. Maybe like 10 more minutes.
Okay.
Let's pivot one more time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember any early advice that from your early mentors that you still live by today? Do you want to share that with the world?
Yeah, I think that probably it's probably the one of the most important things is always have kind of a beginner's mind, right? I think I've always remembered that That I got that advice, and I always remember that, because in every phase of the company's journey, whatever you're facing, right? If you can have that freshness of a beginner's mind, right? That's a very powerful thing, right?
How do you maintain that? Because I find myself losing that over time.
Mhm.
Like you live in one place and then you get used to it. I feel like that at work at times. So how do you actually keep that?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of that, and I struggle with that a lot as well. And I think a lot of it is, how do you manage your cadences, right? And what I mean by that is, as you get your company going, you start to fall into a rhythm, right? And it's good. You want to run things with a certain cadence, right? So for me, I divide up my calendar into what I do on Mondays with, management meetings and one-on-ones, to when I do my sales forecasting and revenue and things like that, versus when I do products and technology, when I do customer success. So each day has a theme. But as you start to do a lot of running, right, what you stop doing is a lot of building. So there's this balance of what percentage of your time are you just running and what percent of the time are you building. And I think the building part, you have to dedicate other rhythms and cadences to. So you're forcing yourself on a monthly basis, on a weekly basis. You're stepping back and looking at that. I still, every Saturday, I still get together with my co-founder, and we take a step back and we look at the business and we think about, what are we doing well? What do we need to evolve? And then we continue. We've done that for the last 17 years.
Great.
And that forces a certain level of discipline around freshness of thinking, stepping back. It doesn't mean we do a great job of this, but at least dedicating the time where it's out of the day-to-day fire drills and the day-to-day running of the business to actually build the business, right? And so that ratio of how much of your time are you spending running versus how much of the time are you spending building? Because the building part is what's going to help you reflect and then have a bit of that beginner's mind. And I'd also say, like, the beginner's mind, a lot of that stuff is also look for outside perspectives, right? The answer is in the market. There are other things that people have tried and done that if you are able to benefit from what you see out there, then you can save yourself a lot of time and energy.